Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Please consider subscribing and check out our Patreon for more. Enjoy the video. Damien looked in the bathroom, hands gripping the sides of the sink. 30 years stared back at him from tired eyes. 30 years spent suffocating under the weight of an identity that never quite fit. In the fluorescent light, the angular planes of his face looked harsh, unfamiliar, foreign. He took a deep breath, shoulders rising and falling, leaned in closer until his forehead nearly touched the cool glass. "My name is Damia," he whispered. The words felt strange on his tongue, unpracticed. "I use she/her pronouns." Silence rang in his ears, broken only by the drip of the leaky faucet. Damien squeezed his eyes shut. This was supposed to be a new beginning, a chance to finally live authentically in a city where no one knew him, where he could introduce himself as Damia without a trace of his past trailing behind like a shadow. But doubt crept in, insidious and cold. Who was he kidding? He couldn't just shed 30 years like an old skin. Becoming Damia wouldn't be as simple as choosing a new name and different pronouns. Damien released his death grip on the sink and stepped back, studying his reflection once more. Broad shoulders, strong jawline, permanent 5 o'clock shadow no matter how close he shaved. Could he really walk into his new job tomorrow and convince his co-workers that this was the face of a woman named Damia? He scrubbed a hand over his face and sighed. Too late to back out now. He'd already accepted the job offer, signed a lease on a tiny studio apartment. This was supposed to be his dream opportunity. A chance to join a progressive tech startup and leave behind the soul-crushing corporate world. Damien had promised himself that this would also be the chance to leave Damien behind. He'd chosen the name Damia carefully, poring over baby name websites and etymology dictionaries. It meant to tame, subdue in Greek. He hoped it would give him the strength to finally subdue the fears and doubts that had plagued him for 3 decades. With a final deep breath, Damien flicked off the light and padded into his bedroom. He'd laid out his outfit for tomorrow on the bed, a flowy blouse and form-fitting slacks he hoped would hint at curves he didn't have. Simple jewelry to accessorize. Nothing too overt. Baby steps. As he slipped under the covers and closed his eyes, Damien silently mouthed his new name like a prayer, over and over until sleep pulled him under. The next morning, Damia's alarm pierced through the gray pre-dawn light. She groaned and slapped blindly at her nightstand until blessed silence resumed. 5 more minutes. No, she couldn't be late on her first day. Damia hauled herself upright, sheets tangled around her long legs. In the bathroom, she avoided looking at her reflection as she went through her morning ablutions. Only once she was fully dressed did Damia risk a glance in the mirror, the flowy top draped over her frame, feminizing her silhouette. She'd watched countless YouTube tutorials on basic makeup, and she thought she'd done an adequate job with subtle contouring and a pop of color on her lips. Her dark hair nearly brushed her shoulders. "You've got this," she told her reflection, injecting confidence she didn't feel into her voice. "You're Damia now! Own it!" But her heart thrummed a staccato rhythm against her ribs as she grabbed her messenger bag and travel mug of coffee. During the bus ride to her new office, Damia rehearsed her introduction over and over in her head. Should she mention her pronouns right away? Or wait to see how progressive this place really was? Coming out to HR was one thing. Facing a group of strangers was something else entirely. Cool sweat beaded along her hairline and in her palms as the bus pulled up to her stop. Damia took a sip of coffee, hoping the caffeine would calm the butterflies rioting in her stomach. No such luck. The lobby of the converted warehouse was already bustling as Damia stepped inside, the heels of her sensible flats clicking on the polished concrete. She felt eyes slide over her as she approached the front desk and opened her mouth to introduce herself to the sleek blonde receptionist, but the words lodged in her throat. Her new name, so carefully chosen and practiced, suddenly felt unwieldy on her tongue. Panic welled in her chest. The receptionist arched one perfectly shaped brow. "Can I help you?" Her gaze cut to Damia's ID badge. "Damien, is it? They're expecting you on the 3rd floor." Damia swallowed hard. This was her chance, her opportunity to declare her true self. She briefly closed her eyes and summoned Damien's voice with effort. "Actually, it's Damia," she said hoarsely. I go by Damia now, and use she, her pronouns." The receptionist blinked once before her professional mien returned. "Of course. My apologies, Damia. Let me update your badge. 3rd floor to the left." Damia managed a tight smile as she clipped the freshly printed badge to her blouse. One introduction down, now to repeat it a dozen more times. She headed for the gleaming bank of elevators. Despite the receptionist's directions, Damia still managed to get turned around on the sprawling 3rd floor, a maze of open-concept workstations and glass-walled offices. Her new co-workers hunched over computers, ensconced in headphones. No one paid her any attention as she wandered. At last, she found a placard with her new name outside a small windowed office. Her pulse kicked up as she gripped the handle and stepped inside the organized chaos of an IT command center. A dozen heads swiveled in her direction. Damia clasped her clammy palms behind her back. "Hi, everyone," she said, hating how shaky her voice sounded. "I'm Damia, the new cloud migration specialist." A beat of silence. She held her breath. Then a lanky guy with thick-rimmed glasses and a Star Trek t-shirt across the room, and Damia's skin prickled under the scrutiny. But then he broke into a disarming grin. "Hey, Damia. Great to have you on board," he said, pushing to his feet and ambling over with an outstretched hand. "I'm Amir, one of the infrastructure leads. Let me introduce you to the team." As Amir led her around the room and she exchanged greetings and handshakes, Damia felt some of the tightness in her chest start to ease. No one looked at her askance when she stated her name and pronouns. No one snickered or raised a skeptical brow. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. Maybe here, in this place, with these people, Damia could finally be herself, fully and without compromise or explanation. With that thought bolstering her, Damia settled behind her new desk and booted up her computer, ready to dive into the challenging work of the startup. She had a job to do and a future to build. A future where the woman in the mirror and the woman in her soul were one and the same. As the morning wore on, Damia found herself slowly relaxing into the rhythm of her new workplace. Most of her teammates seemed not to bat an eye at her introduction, simply welcoming her aboard and offering to lend a hand as she got up to speed on the company's cloud architecture. Amir, in particular, took her under his wing, patiently walking her through the tangled nest of their codebase and cracking jokes to put her at ease. Damia even found herself laughing along, the knot of anxiety in her chest loosening inch by inch. But just as she was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, this transition would be smoother than she'd dared to hope, Damia overheard a snide mutter from the workstation behind her. "Guess they'll hire anyone these days," a nasal male voice said, just loud enough to carry. "Even dudes in dresses." Damia stiffened, her fingers freezing on her keyboard. Heat flooded her cheeks as snickers broke out around the offending workstation. She snuck a glance over her shoulder to see an older man with wispy silver hair and watery blue eyes smirking at her. His employee badge read Bob Schumann, Senior Account Executive. Great. Apparently, even a supposedly progressive tech startup wasn't immune to bigoted old guard types. Damia gritted her teeth and refocused on her onboarding paperwork, determined not to let the snide remark shake her. She'd endured far worse in her previous male-dominated engineering jobs. A gentle tap on her shoulder made Damia startle. She looked up to see Amir standing over her, an apologetic grimace on his face. "Hey, I'm really sorry about Bob," he said, keeping his voice low. "He's old school and set in his ways. We've tried to get him to do sensitivity training, but—" Amir shrugged helplessly. Damia managed a wan smile. "It's okay. Well, it's not okay, but I'm used to it. I can handle a few ignorant comments." Amir still looked troubled, but he nodded. Well, if he or anyone else keeps harassing you, let me or HR know, okay? We've got a strict policy against that crap here. Thanks, I appreciate it. Damia's smile this time was a little more genuine. It was good to know that at least some of her colleagues had her back. As if on cue, a tall woman with a sleek auburn bob and a no-nonsense air approached Damia's workstation, tablet in hand. Damia, right? I'm Julia, the senior dev lead. Ready for me to show you the ropes? More than ready, Damia said, jumping to her feet. She was itching to dive into some actual coding and put Bob's jackassery out of her mind. Julia led her to a glass-walled conference room where she proceeded to give Damia a crash course in the company's agile development cycle and the particular project she'd be joining. As they pored over Scrum boards and Gantt charts, Damia found herself warming to Julia's wry humor and obvious technical chops. It was only when Julia offhandedly mentioned her wife that understanding clicked into place for Damia. The subtle lilt to Julia's voice, the hints of softness beneath her tailored button-down, Julia was like her. Maybe not in the exact same way, but a kindred spirit nonetheless. Suddenly, the idea of navigating this new identity on her own felt a little less daunting. Julia was living proof that Damia could be both a kick-ass coder and an openly transgender woman. Hope bloomed warm in her chest, and Damia threw herself into the rest of the onboarding with renewed focus. By the time evening rolled around, her notebook was crammed with arcane network diagrams, and her brain buzzed pleasantly with new information. Julia seemed equally pleased as they wrapped up. Awesome job today, Damia. I think you're really going to hit the ground running. She hesitated, then added more softly. And hey, I just want you to know, my PM box is always open. For technical questions or if you ever need to talk about other stuff. I've been where you are. Damia blinked rapidly against the sudden sting of tears. Thank you. That means a lot. Julia squeezed her shoulder. Us girls have to stick together, right? Now go home and get some rest. Tomorrow, the real work begins. Damia was still riding the high of that camaraderie the next morning, despite the early hour as she settled in for her first real day on the job. She hummed happily to herself as her dev environment loaded, fingers twitching in anticipation, at least until a notification popped up on her screen. A summons to a project kickoff meeting, with none other than Bob. Damia's mouth went dry. She'd really been hoping to avoid the crotchety account exec for a while longer, but there was no getting around the fact that as the technical lead, she'd have to work closely with him on this particular client deliverable. Dragging her feet, Damia collected her laptop and notebook and trudged to the designated conference room. She slipped into a seat near the door, avoiding eye contact with Bob, who was already sprawled at the head of the table. As the rest of the team filed in, Bob called the meeting to order. Morning, everyone. As you can see, we have a new face joining us today. His watery gaze cut to Damia, a hint of a smirk playing about his thin lips. Guess we'd better do introductions. I'm Bob, account lead. I've been with the company 15 years. And you are? He let the question hang, loaded with unspoken derision. Damia felt her face flush, but she lifted her chin and met his stare dead on. Damia, she said clearly. Cloud engineer. My pronouns are she and her. Bob scoffed, not even bothering to hide his eye roll. Right, well, I don't have time to play pretend, so let's just get down to business, Anger flashed hot under Damia's skin, even as her stomach twisted with humiliation. To be so casually dismissed, so thoroughly disrespected in front of her new team. She opened her mouth, a sharp retort on the tip of her tongue, but Bob was already forging ahead, pulling up design specs on the large screen and assigning tasks. Damia snapped her jaw shut. As much as she longed to put the arrogant ass in his place, she couldn't afford to make a scene, not on her first real day. So she gritted her teeth and endured Bob's cutting microaggressions throughout the rest of the meeting. Snide insinuations about her technical competency, backhanded compliments about how well she was adjusting. Each one landed like a barb in Damia's skin, making it harder and harder to maintain her slipping composure. By the end of the kickoff, Damia's nails were digging bloody crescents into her palms beneath the table. She was out of her chair like a shot the moment Bob dismissed them, not caring that it probably looked like she was running away. Damia made a beeline for the bathroom, desperate for a moment of solitude to collect herself. She shouldered into the first open stall and slumped back against the door, finally letting the frustrated tears come. Was it always going to be like this? Constantly having to defend her identity, her very existence to small-minded pricks? She'd hoped that living as her true self would be easier, but so far it felt like an uphill battle every step of the way. A tentative knock on the main bathroom door startled Damia out of her spiraling thoughts. "Damia, you in there? It's Julia!" Damia hastily wiped her cheeks and took a few deep breaths before emerging to face her mentor. Julia's brow was creased with concern. "Hey, I saw what happened in that meeting. Are you okay?" "Not really," Damia admitted, her voice wavering. I don't know how I'm going to deal with Bob and his bigoted bullshit." Julia sighed, leaning back against the row of sinks. "I wish I could tell you it gets easier, but some people are determined to stay ignorant no matter what HR mandates." Her mouth twisted ruefully. God knows I've dealt with my fair share of Bobs over the years. Hearing that even someone as unflappable and self-assured as Julia still faced similar prejudice made Damia's heart ache anew. Would they ever be seen as anything more than their transness? But wallowing wouldn't help her now. "So what do I do?" Damia asked, hating how small and lost she sounded. "I don't want to make waves so soon, but I can't just let him trample all over me either." "You don't back down," Julia said firmly. "Bob's a dinosaur, and he's going to keep roaring until he realizes he doesn't scare you. Correct him every time he uses the wrong pronouns. Call him out when he makes shitty little comments. Show him that you're not going to be cowed into submission." She reached out to grip Damia's shoulders, her gaze intense. "You are an incredible, brilliant woman, and your identity is not up for debate. The sooner Bob accepts that, the better off this whole team will be. And hey," Julia cracked a wry grin, "if he keeps being a tool, I can always reassign him. Perks of being the lead." That startled a soggy laugh out of Damia. "I'll keep that in mind." She dragged a hand over her face. "Thanks, Julia. I really needed this pep talk." "Anytime." Julia gave her shoulders a final squeeze before stepping back. "Now, splash some water on your face and get back out there. We've got a project to crush and a dinosaur to school. You with me?" Damia took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "I'm with you. Let's do this." Over the next few days, Damia threw herself into the project work with single-minded focus. She pored over technical specs late into the night until the lines of code felt etched into the insides of her eyelids. In meetings, she spoke confidently about network dependencies and deployment pipelines, determined to prove her chops to Bob and the rest of the team. But Bob's juvenile taunts continued, a near-constant thrum of background noise as they worked. He misgendered Damia at every opportunity, threw out snide asides about her appearance, questioned her every suggestion in design reviews. Each prick was minor on its own, but cumulatively they left Damia feeling rubbed raw and wrung out. She did her best to follow Julia's advice, correcting Bob firmly whenever he used the wrong pronouns, refusing to let his cutting remarks pass without comment. But engaging only seemed to spur Bob to new heights of casual cruelty. Damia's initial spark of defiance gradually eroded under the incessant grind of his contempt, replaced by a hollow feeling of helpless anger. And it was starting to affect the work. The easy rapport Damia had been building with the rest of the team stuttered and stalled as Bob's remarks grew more and more pointed. She caught pitying looks and averted gazes whenever Bob launched into one of his jokes. No one quite dared to cajole him, but no one stood up for Damia either. It all came to a head one afternoon as they reviewed a tricky bit of middleware integration. Damia was just wrapping up her explanation of a new caching schema when Bob cut her off with a scornful huff. "That's all well and good, Damien," he drawled, putting sarcastic emphasis on her dead name. "But you're forgetting that this client is still on an older version of Python. I know it might be hard for someone like you to keep the details straight, what with having to juggle multiple identities and all, but do try to keep up, Damia saw red. Screw diplomacy, screw not making waves. She was done rolling over and taking Bob's transphobic bullshit. She shot to her feet, palms slamming down on the conference table. "My name," she gritted out, "is Damia. I've told you that a dozen times already, Bob. And my identity as a woman is not something I'm juggling for fun. It's who I am." Bob's mouth dropped open slightly, but Damia forged ahead before he could marshal a response. "I have been nothing but professional and respectful to you since I started here, while you've gone out of your way to undermine and mock me at every turn. Frankly, it's pathetic. You're a grown man threatened by a transgender woman knowing more about tech than you." A muscle in Bob's jaw ticked as he leveled a glare at her. "Now listen here, No, you listen." Damia leaned forward, holding his gaze unwaveringly. "We are colleagues. I am the technical lead on this project. So you can stow the insubordinate attitude and the juvenile taunts, and you can treat me with the basic human decency I deserve. Or I can go straight to Julia and HR and have you removed from this team. Your choice." Thanks for watching. Check out Patreon if you want to have early access to the other parts. If not, it will be online in a couple of days.